Hello, my friends. Welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 5 of my series entitled The Underrated Fallacy. And my central argument in this series is that no matter how much we might want to champion some of our favorite bands, and claim that they're underrated. In other words, they deserve a much bigger audience than they currently have. In most cases, that line of thinking lacks logic. And that's really what I endeavor to explain throughout this series with various examples and illustrations, that for the most part, most heavy music is rated appropriately, right? So in this particular episode, in part 5, we're going to take a little bit of a tangent, but still very related, I think. And sort of we're going to look at the notion, or I guess we could say this uneasy relationship that a lot of heavy music fans have had with accessibility, with music that becomes, you might say, overtly commercialized, right? That we've always had this weird sort of relationship with it. We're going to build on some of the things I talked about in part 4 with King's X. King's X, for many people, is the epitome of the underrated band, at least in the eyes and ears of a lot of their fans. But as I argue with King's X and elsewhere, as I've been saying, really King's X, I think, is rated appropriately. In this particular episode, too, we're going to talk a little bit about the hair metal phenomena, not my favorite side of heavy music, but nevertheless, it fits in well with what we're discussing here. And I'm going to make mention of somebody who is a big deal to me, Alice Cooper. So we're going to talk a little bit about Alice as a case in point in this section as well. All right, so let's dive in a little bit. So does catchiness add value to heavy bands? Okay, well, again, linking it back a little bit with part 4, due to their diversity, describing King's X's music to the uninitiated is actually quite difficult. Somebody was to ask me, okay, how would you describe King's X's music? And yes, they're very diverse. They can be really heavy. They can do all kinds of things. I mean, the best advice I guess I give somebody is go out and listen to them, because they are, they might totally be your cup of tea or not, as the case may be, right? But I think, nevertheless, any King's X supporter would end up emphasizing their liberal use of strong melodies as a key characteristic. So there's lots of ways you could describe King's X, but I think everybody would agree, or everybody's going to say, yep, a lot of melody with that band, right? Now, hard rock, and especially heavy metal, has always had an uneasy and complicated relationship with catchiness, right? Heavy bands that are completely devoid, or almost completely devoid, of memorable hooks and melodies will most certainly limit their audience. So folks that are just in the black metal or hardcore death metal where there's almost no melody, absolutely, you're not going to have a big audience for those bands. It's going to be very select, very narrow, right? But there's the other side to this too. If bands edge too close to simple pop structures, that can perhaps alienate their hardcore base as well. So some heavy bands are always kind of trying to walk that tightrope, right? They want to incorporate melody and catchiness to their music, but they know if they go too far that way, their longtime fans might be put off a little bit, right? Okay, so the hair metal, also known as glam metal spectacle, which peaked commercially in the mid to late 1980s, demonstrated that bands that sported a hard rock appearance could be very financially viable with hookier, softer, and simpler sounds, right? Now, examples of bands that I think are squarely in the hair metal camp, or at least the majority of their material, the majority of their albums would be described as hair metal, very poppy, very commercial, embraced by the mainstream in a big way, at least for a short period of time in the 80s and to some degree into the 90s, would include bands like Def Leppard, actually still very popular today, Quiet Riot, Poison, Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, Rat, Cinderella, Warrant, Wiener, Skid Row, Slaughter. There were lots of them, many, many of them. Not my cup of tea so much. I mean, I might cherry pick the odd album here and there by some of these bands that are okay. I mean, the first couple Def Leppard are okay. First couple Motley Crue are okay. Not my favorites, but most of this stuff sort of not my thing, right? Not that that matters, but may as well throw my biases on the table here, right? Anyway, a little more about this hair metal. In spite of its label, most hair metal was actually pop with loud guitars, right? So yeah, it gets the metal tag, but honestly, most of what I hear in these bands doesn't have much to do with heavy metal and barely even hard rock, I would say, right? It's basically pop. And again, not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But I've always kind of questioned the name of it anyway. The hair thing, I think, implies too. They all had big hair, usually groomed really well, right? They tried to look good for the cameras. They usually were kind of cute, lots of makeup, not Kiss-like makeup, but, makeup to look pretty, I guess, that sort of thing. So that was all part of it too. That was part of the hair thing, right, I guess. But anyway, it was basically pop with loud guitars. As such, these groups failed to gain much credibility throughout much of the heavy community. And a lot of the people who are more hardcore heavy metal fans or even hard rock fans kind of just ignored these bands, or in some cases even ridiculed them as sort of posers, right? Again, I'm more to each their own. At least that's how I am now. And for most of my life, I'd like to think I was too, although I pointed my fingers at them a little bit too back in the day, I have to admit. But generally speaking, I kind of just ignored them, right? Wasn't my cup of tea. It was pretty obvious. A lot of people love a lot of these bands, and that's cool. I mean, if you like it, it's good, right? So it's all good. But where this got a lot more controversial, not just for me, but I would say for a lot of heavy fans, and not just controversial, but I think where some hostility even emerged, was when heavy bands with a respected history, those bands that chose or perhaps were pressured by record labels to go hair metal, right? So it's one thing when, Slaughter and Skid Row and Poison and Bon Jovi are doing their poppy thing, and we can just sort of go, yeah, whatever. If people like it, cool, whatever. But when there's bands that we've loved for a long time and they start shifting into Bon Jovi territory, then we're like, okay, hang on here. Now you're taking some of ours, right? And that's when I think a lot of heavy fans got their backs up a little bit. Indeed, the overt commercializing of cherished artists did not sit well with many heavy fans, regardless of exploding sales. I mean, there's no question, for a period of time, this was big, big business. Hence, I mean, the big reason why a lot of bands started shifting and heavy bands started becoming poppier, because there was a lot of money to be made here, right? Here are a few examples. I won't go too crazy here, but there were examples of, and these were bands that, again, had a pedigree for, respected hard rock or heavy metal. And they had their hair metal moments, right? And these are albums, I have to say, they're not my favorites. A couple of these albums are okay, but these would be sort of the, these are the sore thumbs and otherwise usually pretty good catalogs. And they tended to be when these bands went hair metal. So I just categorize them very, very loosely here. But here are some heavy bands with 70s origins that certainly had their hair metal moments, right? Aerosmith. Well, I talked about Aerosmith quite a bit in previous episodes, so obviously I won't say a lot here. But once Aerosmith got the Permanent Vacation, Pump, Get a Grip, and arguably almost everything since then, Aerosmith was pretty much dabbling in the hair metal market. Before that, I mean, Aerosmith was always melodic, always had catchy stuff, but they were gritty, they were more blues-based, more sort of jean jacket crowd sort of bass type band. But by the time they got to Permanent Vacation, poppier, they certainly tried to cultivate a more pretty image, you might say, or at least Steven Tyler did, right? So there was definitely a hair metal shift there. Alice Cooper, one of my all-time heroes, no question about it, has his hair metal phase, which didn't thrill me as much as it thrilled other people, because obviously he gained big audiences with Trash and Hey Stupid. More to say about that coming up. Judas Priest, talking about the band, I'm not getting upset here, but Judas Priest, along with Black Sabbath, Probably the band most recognized for sort of forging heavy metal in the early days. But Judas Priest had their hair metal moment where they were barely, the Turbo album, to me, I don't hear much metal on that. I'm not even sure there's a lot of hard rock there, To me, it's pretty poppy. So thankfully it didn't last long, but hey, they had their hair metal moment. Now, Kiss was interesting. Kiss was always melodic. Kiss always had anthems. So I guess their venture into hair metal wasn't quite the stretch as it was for other bands. But when they took their makeup off in the 1980s, so, Lick It Up was the first album where Kiss took off the makeup. Now, Lick It Up to me doesn't sound like a hair metal album. That sounds like a pretty typical hard rock and Kiss album. But by the time we get to Animalized and Asylum, pretty decent albums, but I think there's a shift towards more poppiness. Certainly by the time you hit Crazy Nights and Hot in the Shade, they're full on hair metal at this point, Kiss. Kind of fitted Paul Stanley's persona reasonably well. Gene Simmons always looked kind of lost in their hair metal days. But anyway, they came back. A lot of these bands did get out of this phase, some not, most did, right? Ted Nugent had a hair metal phase, I would argue. That's something you wouldn't have guessed if when you listen to Ted's early mid 70s albums, this was a pretty uncompromising guitar slinger, one of the most important hard rock American guitarists. He probably doesn't get his due in some ways because of his political stances, but nevertheless, he was very popular. But by the time we get into the 80s, right, Ted was doing hair metal. With Penetrator, especially Little Miss Dangerous. A lot of people like that album. It's not my favorite, but Ted was doing hair metal. And then also with the supergroup Damn Yankees, which also had Tommy Shaw from Styx and Jack Blades from Night Ranger, kind of hair metalish there too. But that band was very poppy. Yeah, Ted was still, playing some pretty good guitar solos, but that was basically pop to a large degree, right? Ted pulls out of it, but for a while he was pretty hair metal. Rainbow, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, most famous, I guess, for Deep Purple, but also Rainbow, early Rainbow was very uncompromising hard rock, very innovative. Michael Schenker, probably most famous for his time in UFO, but then also his early solo career, MSG, also very uncompromising, heavy guitar, lots of guitar with both these guys. They had their very poppy moments. With Rainbow, it was with vocalist Jolyn Turner for 3 albums. And with Michael Schenker, it was with vocalist Robin McAuley for 3 albums as well. Very hair metal-ish, these albums, I would say. Triumph, another, Rick Emmett, a highly respected guitar slinger, Canadian guitar slinger. Again, Triumph, pretty much hardcore hard rock band, diverse, absolutely, as a lot of 70s bands were, but I think they got into became quite poppy with Thunder 7 and really poppy with the Sport of Kings. That was their hair metal moment. Uriah Heep, long time heavy band, also very diverse and lots of melodies. So I'm not saying this is entirely a stretch for all these bands, right? But Uriah Heep, very early 1970s, probably not quite as influential in the formation of heavy metal as, say, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, later Judas Priest, but they're in there for sure. But again, by the time we get to Abominog, Head First, Equator, and a couple others, that's full-on hair metal as far as I'm concerned. Whitesnake, again, always pretty melodic, but again, in the hair metal, they embraced the hair metal movement, was slided in, especially with the Whitesnake album of 1987, which was just a massive seller. A lot of people would say Whitesnake was kind of the epitome of hair metal as well. I don't know if I would say that. I don't know if they're quite on par with, say, Poison and Warrant and those bands, because Whitesnake's earlier history was not quite as full on pop. They were pretty rock and roll, I think, less so than hair metal. But anyway, they certainly got into hair metal, much like American band Y&T as well. Always very melodic, but were far more hard rock and earlier on and got a whole lot poppier in the 80s. They were definitely on the hair metal bandwagon. And then there were a number of bands, I'm just listing a few here, but a number of bands in the new wave of British heavy metal era or genre. Very important genre in the late 1970s, early 80s that spawned some really influential, important bands that really gave heavy metal a shot in the arm that it needed at the time. Iron Maiden has probably become the most successful band to come out of the new wave of British heavy metal, and Iron Maiden never had a hair metal moment, I am happy to report. But a lot of their contemporaries did. I mean, not Motorhead, not Venom, the hardest of the new wave of British heavy metal tended not to. But there were some really heavy bands that did. Raven, Saxon, and Tigers of Pantane are great examples. All of these bands, their early albums were very hard driving metal, very influential. And then they kind of bought in. They thought, well, if it worked for Def Leppard, maybe we'll give it a shot. It didn't work for these bands at all. I would say it completely killed the Tigers of Pantane's career. They never came back from it. Raven, it took them years to gain back something close to the fan base that they had before they went hair metal. And Saxon, too, took a lot of albums that convinced us, hey, they really are metal guys. This was just a diversion, right? So they paid a price there. Accept was a German, is a German heavy metal band. They coincide nicely with the new wave of British heavy metal, really. Although they're not British, but again, very melodic, very heavy early on, very influential, and they had sort of their hair metal moment with Eat the Heat, where they got rid of Udo, the original vocalist, and brought in a prettier lead vocalist, if I can put it that way. And Celtic Frost, maybe the most, the biggest abomination in the hard metal hair metal shift. And you know what? Those last two groups, I'm just gonna go to a couple pictures here. The whole hair metal phenomena, it wasn't just that the music had to be poppier. That was the big part, but the look had to be more appealing, more commercial as well, right? To appeal to the masses. So I mentioned Accept. So here's the heavy version of Accept with Udo Dirkschneider. Now, Udo, here he is. He's not a very tall guy. And again, how should I put this? Not the prettiest guy on the block. Let's put it that way, right? And who cares, really? Well, actually, a lot of people care in the hair metal world, right? He wore army fatigues. In fact, the whole band was not going out of their way to look good for the cameras at all. But in their hair metal phase, they brought in David Rees, the vocalist. Again, a perfectly good vocalist in a lot of ways, but the music was poppier, and their image was far more cultivated to be maybe not as pretty as Poison, but they were going in that direction, right? You could see. And then, they got out of it pretty quickly. Udo comes back for a few albums. They're back being Accept and great again, and then Udo's gone and Mark Torino comes in, and their last 5 albums with Mark have been amazing heavy metal as well, right? Now, here's the one that is maybe the most extreme version of the hair metal conversion that worked badly. One of my all-time heroes, especially in the underground metal, and I talk about this in other episodes too, right, is Thomas Gabriel Warrior. He was the brains behind Hellhammer, Celtic Frost, and most recently Triptychon, 3 incredibly innovative bands. Celtic Frost in particular is cited as one of the most foundational bands in the formation of the subgenre black metal, along with Venom and Bathory and Merciful Fate. So here's metal Celtic Frost, for which they were most of the time. And here's Tom looking pretty grim, looking very black metal, very extreme. Here's what Tom looks like today in his band called Triptychon. Again, pretty grim, pretty scary to some people, right? I'll tell you what, for me, this is when Tom looked the scariest. Here they are as hair metal Celtic Frost. There's Tom. That is scary to me. That scares the heck out of me. It was a poppy album, complete shift from this underground, innovative band, very extreme, to being these pop guys looking like, I don't know, and I even compare, looking like Poison, looking like Cinderella. I mean, here's Tom. He could have fit in with these dudes real easy. I mean, it was an abomination. Anyway, so you can see where that a few of our most cherished bands sort of, got into this hair metal craze. And a lot of us, hey, like I said, bands that were full on hair metal, we just sort of ignored, Bon Jovi, whatever, right? But when Celtic Frost is going hair metal and Accept's going hair metal, and Richie Blackmore's doing it, it's like, okay, hang on here. We're not digging this at all, right? And it even affected some of the blues-based hard rock bands too, or rock bands, with the crossover success of ZZ Top's Eliminator, right? Eliminator was just a huge, huge album for ZZ. I don't know, okay, it might be a stretch to be calling it hair metal. I mean, well, beard metal, I don't know, not really. But it certainly was popular for ZZ Top, right? And so even blues-influenced rock artists took a fleeting stab at hair metalism. I'm arguing it is, but it certainly was popular, right? And so, because it worked so well for ZZ, at least commercially, if not critically, Molly Hatchet, Blackfoot, 38 Special, and Foghat also had their hair metal moments, right? In these more blues-oriented rock bands. In so doing, some of these acts compromised greatly, others less so. I'll leave it to the reader to decide who committed the greatest atrocities. Okay, so some may split hairs and defend. I mean, there might, and again, this is just how I hear it, how I see it. I'm not saying I'm right here. There might be a lot of folks who love those albums I just listed. That's cool, right? And some may split hairs and defend that a few of these artists, I mean, maybe Uriah Heep, Ted Nugent, Rainbow, right, were actually pursuing, say, a Foreigner or Boston type AOR direction, right? Now, as ambiguous as the adult or album-oriented rock tag is, I'm still not really sure what that means, right? But we do know it implies softer, more mature music, right? Again, I don't really like that description, but that's usually how people see it, right? Yet within this context, AOR and hair metal meant essentially the same thing to the heavy metal fan, right? So, okay, if you don't want to call this hair metal, then you want to call it more AOR direction. To us, it didn't matter, right? The bottom line was it was a blatant shift to lighter material to go after the pop audiences, right? And we just didn't dig it, or a lot of the more hardcore metal people just didn't like this, right? So indeed, it took some time, some effort to make it up to the hardcore followings once the hair metal fad passed, and it did. In fact, grunge kind of killed it in the 1990s, right? And heavier and or far less pop-oriented directions that got rid of much of the hair metal trappings, right, were required to keep careers intact. Bands after grunge, if you kept going the hair metal way, you probably weren't going to have much of a career. So a lot of those bands that were heavier hard rock, they resorted back to what made them famous in the first place, right? So some became effectively retro acts. I think Kiss, Whitesnake, and Y&T after their hair metal times. I mean, all those bands have put out new albums since, but let's face it, they sell they tour on the old stuff that they did before their hair metal phase, right? Others, though, emphasize the more balanced combination of old and new material, right? Judas Priest, Saxon, Raven, Alice Cooper, Ted Nugent, etc., right? So again, yes, all of those bands, if you see them live, will play the old stuff, but they've put out a lot of really great new albums too, right? And they've kind of just passed over a lot of the hair metal stuff, although they maybe have kept a couple of the hits from it. And that's sort of been the thing. But what we've seen with these bands, once the hair metal movement passed, right, was a renewed commitment to heaviness and or less compromising hard rock, right? The bottom line is this: it is perilous to contrive catchiness, right? In the heavy world, okay? If it's naturally there, if you're a band that's naturally melodic and that's what you've done all the way through, then that's one thing. And then generally that's fine. I mean, I would say King's X is an example of that. They've always been melodic. It's always been part of their DNA, right? We're never going to hold it against King's X, or I would argue even Van Halen. Van Halen had a lot to do with pushing some bands towards hair metal, but I don't think Van Halen was ever inauthentic in providing catchier material. It was always part of what they did. They were a hard rock band based largely around the guitar gymnastics of the immortal Eddie Van Halen, but they always had catchy music, right? So I don't think you could ever accuse Van Halen of selling out. I think they always did what seemed right for them, right? They weren't trying to just cash in. But bands that did just try to cash in on trends, those are the ones that usually that we held a lot against, right? And they saw an abandonment of significant portions of their fan base when they did that, right? So that's the uneasy relationship, right? that a lot of heavy fans have with bands that become too commercial, if you like. It's usually around, did it feel authentic or not? You know, it's one thing to have some hits. It's one thing to have a few songs that the mainstream like. I mean, most of us, I don't think have a problem with that. It's how they're doing it, right? And so I want to dwell on that a little bit. And I'm going to especially talk about Alice Cooper in this one. So how do heavy fans value catchy, accessible hits? So this kind of links it to with the big picture here, where I'm talking about, you know, can heavy bands be undervalued or overvalued or that sort of thing, right? Okay, Alice Cooper, Kiss, Ted Nugent, Aerosmith, and lots of others, right, have numerous hits and classic songs from the 1970s. So you might ask, how is this different from trying to get a smash in the 1980s during the hair metal era, right? So you might say, okay, what am I talking about here? You know, I'm beating up Alice Cooper and Ted Nugent and Kiss for trying to get hits in the hair metal movement, but these bands have always had hits, right? So am I kind of talking out of both sides of my mouth here? Well, I hopefully not on purpose, right? I don't think I am. I think it has to do with perceived authenticity, right? Which is sort of what I've been trying to get at here. It's a concept that's intuitively very important, but hard to describe, and I'm going to give it a shot. We're going to talk about Alice Cooper here. So here's what I mean by this. Anytime I hear Alice Cooper's I'm 18 or Under My Wheels or School's Out or No More Mr. Nice Guy, right? I am struck by how these hit songs, and they're big hits, and they were in the 70s and they still are. But I'm struck how these hit songs naturally integrate within those innovative 1970s albums, right? So they're from Love It to Death, Killers, School's Out, and Billion Dollar Babies, respectively, right? More on that in a second. None of these hit songs, whether it be No More Mr. Nice Guy or School's Out, they don't give off a vibe of a band trying to court any particular audience, or they don't sound like they're trying to follow a trend. They're just great songs on highly diverse albums that happen to become hits, right? When I hear I'm 18, it still doesn't sound like anybody else. It doesn't sound like the Alice Cooper band was sort of listening to their radio and going, okay, let's contrive a hit. What's sort of happening now? Okay, let's do this song Under My Wheels. Well, nothing really sounds like Under My Wheels, right? Nothing really sounds like those albums. And those hit songs fit in nicely on the albums. Like, they make sense within the context of the album. So it doesn't feel like a contrived thing just to make money. Those songs naturally became popular because they're great songs, bottom line, right? Or at least that's how I hear it, right? None of these songs or albums sound like anyone else. They exude the unique Alice Cooper musical trademark through and through, right? Whereas the smash songs Poison and Feed My Frankenstein, Poison, I think is just about Alice Cooper's biggest song, right? It's probably on par in popularity these days with even School's Out and No More Mr. Nice Guy and I'm 18, the big ones from the 70s, right? But I'm arguing songs like Poison and Feed My Frankenstein, and indeed pretty much anything off of the Trash and Hate Stupid albums, the hair metal albums, have a much more generic feel. They're highly reminiscent of countless other bands riding the hair metal wave at the time, right? I'm not saying that these are bad songs or even that they're necessarily bad albums. They're not my favorite Alice albums, but they're okay, right? But I don't think anyone would use the terms like revolutionary or innovative or even important to describe this era of Alice Cooper. I think that's the difference, right? However, some, perhaps many, may consider hair metal Alice to be inauthentic, right? Particularly in comparison to the rest of the catalog, which at its best is artistically innovative, even if it's not always commercially successful. Okay? So this is sort of what I'm getting at. It's not that Poison is necessarily a bad song. It's just that it sounds like everything else that was going on at the time. It sounds like all kinds of everything else I'm hearing from all these other hair metal bands. It doesn't feel like it's a true Alice Cooper. It might be, people might think it's a great song, or a lot of people certainly do, right? But it doesn't feel like a true Alice Cooper song. It sounds more like Alice Cooper trying to be hair metal, if you know what I mean. It doesn't feel as authentic as, say, I'm 18, right? Let me build on this just a little more. So let's look at some of Alice's catalog here. And what I've done, I've listed not the entire catalog of Alice Cooper, because there are a lot of albums and most of them are just amazing. Like I really do love Alice's catalog, and I'm a huge fan. But what I've done is I've pulled out the albums that have a big hit, right? Or a substantial classic song that was played over and over, made the top lists, and still is played a lot, say, in classic rock radio today, that sort of thing, right? So from Love It to Death, and I'm calling them authentic hit singles versus questionable authenticity, okay? For reasons I'm going to explain. So what I'm trying to explain here is that not all hits are equal, right? Some sound a whole lot more authentic than others. Okay. I argue that those early hits were very authentic because, as I said, there was nothing else that sounded like them. There's still nothing that sounds like them today. They still sound fresh. They don't feel contrived. They sit nicely within these albums, right? So I'm 18 was an authentic hit single from Love It to Death. I would defend that. There were a couple hit singles from the 1971 Killer, Under My Wheels and Be My Lover. You still hear them on the radio all the time. They sound authentic to me, right? They don't sound like a band trying to get a hit. They sound like a band just trying to write great songs on the Killer album, and a couple just got popular, right? School's Out is the big hit from that album, right? It's actually the only big hit from that album. But again, it doesn't feel contrived. It makes sense within the context of the album, the concept album, right? And it's still nothing really sounds like it today. Billion Dollar Babies, the album from 73, is still Alice Cooper's biggest selling album, right? It had a number of hits from the album. The three biggies were Hello, Hooray, Elected, and No More Mr. Nice Guy. Again, these all sound authentic to me. They don't sound like anybody else. They sound like a band just trying to write great songs. It really doesn't sound like anything else, right? And it just happened. The world really caught on to them, right? Then Alice Cooper goes solo. So these are 4 albums from the original Alice Cooper band. There are 3 others, but they didn't have big hits, so I didn't include them on here. Then Alice goes solo, right? And at least initially, his solo career, he continued to have some hits. Welcome to My Nightmare was a smash album, and there are a couple, big hits. And I still think these are authentic singles. I don't think Alice was trying to write hit singles at this point. He just had a couple songs that caught on. The title track, and especially Only Women Bleed. Now, Only Women Bleed was a ballad, right? But it seemed very authentic to me because it's a very complicated ballad. It's a song that builds, right? It's not your typical ballad because there's all kinds of moving parts to it. It's almost a little proggy. It's structured a little like Stairway to Heaven and Bohemian Rhapsody, all kinds of interesting stuff. I don't consider those inauthentic hits either. I think they're great songs that just caught on. Same with Only Women Bleed. But it provided a bit of a blueprint going forward because it was on the ballad side. Alice kind of had an idea, okay, I can make a lot of money doing this. So the Goes to Hell album of 1976, now I think for the first time, Alice Cooper's getting some hits that I don't think are that authentic. I'll Never Cry, I Never Cry, and then You and Me from Lace and Whiskey, and then From the Inside, How Are You Gonna See Me Now? I think all of these songs, they're all flat out ballads. There's nothing tricky about them. It doesn't have the twists and turns of Only Women Bleed. They're full-on ballads that I tell you, Barry Manilow could have sang them. Karen Carpenter could have sang them. Captain and Tennille, it's about as heavy as Captain and Tennille. That's what was happening at the time. At that time in the 70s, very vanilla, very poppy, soft. That's what was big on the charts. And Alice was writing songs that were fitting right in. Now, the whole albums aren't like those, thankfully, but those songs were all smash hits, top 10 singles. Big sellers for Alice, right? I mean, You and Me was even covered by Frank Sinatra, for Pete's sake. I mean, so that gives you an idea of what he's going after. This is not authentic Alice Cooper. This is Alice Cooper making millions of dollars selling to basically the vanilla audience, the pure pop audience who would probably be listening to the Carpenters and, this Alice Cooper dame, probably didn't even know it was a guy, well, I guess they knew that once they heard him, but you know what I mean, right? They probably knew nothing about Alice Cooper, but I like that You and Me song. Isn't that a sweet little tune, Seemed completely inauthentic to me, right? And then so we go forward. the Flush the Fashion album, which is a pretty decent album, there was a hit single called Clones We're All. And I mean, it's a pretty cool song. As far as the inauthentic hits go, it's pretty cool. But the reason I don't call this authentic either is because this was Alice Cooper doing new wave, right? This sounded like a Cars song, right? And in the 1980s, that's what was big in top 40. It was new wave poppy hits, which was really the pop, form of punk, right? So Alice took a shot at it and hit gold with Clones, right? But again, it didn't feel like Alice Cooper. It felt like Alice trying to get a hit. And I got to say, that's what he did with hair metal, right? Poison from the Trash album, like I say, it could be his biggest hit ever. I mean, it would rival Schools Out these days, et cetera. A lot of people really love Poison. I know when I go see Alice Cooper live, whenever he plays Poison, the place goes nuts. It's not a bad song. It's not like I hate it, right? But it doesn't feel authentic. It feels like Alice Cooper writing a hair metal song at the right time because that's what was selling, right? Same with Hey Stupid and Feed My Frankenstein. They're a little heavier, but they're still pretty full-on hair metal, right? Okay, so you sort of get my point there, I think. Okay, so let's kind of bring this home. So, as such, it's highly unlikely that a diehard Alice Cooper fan is going to actively champion Poison, regardless of how much the mainstream loves it, right? It's certainly not in the same way they would champion I'm 18, right? But what about everybody else? So the diehard Alice Cooper fans, say like myself, I mean, we kind of look at Poison with sort of a bit of a cross on our face. I don't know about this song. I know why everybody likes it, but it doesn't feel like Alice. Whereas I'm 18, is just as accessible as Poison, but we're like, yeah, I'm 18, right? Well, what about everybody else, right? More precisely, how should a song like Poison actually be valued? So if we bring this back to my overall thesis here about, our song, our heavy songs or bands, can they be underrated or even overrated? Or how do we value a song like Poison, right? Is it underrated? Is it overrated? Well, as I've been pretty consistent in this whole series, I don't think it's either. Poison is rated appropriately, right? Even if I don't particularly like it, I think it's rated appropriately. 3 scenarios which lead to the same place are worth exploring for clarity. So how do we actually value a song like Poison? Okay. Well, one thing we know for sure, granted, a lot of this is subjective, but we know for sure Poison was a hit or is a hit. That is indisputable. You don't have to like it. Lots of hardcore Cooper fans probably aren't that thrilled with it, but it's a hit, okay? So let's consider the people who like the song Poison, but they're not necessarily Alice Cooper fans, okay? So let's consider that. So those who like the song and not necessarily Alice Cooper already know about Poison, right? This is not news to them, right? It's a big hit. It gets played everywhere. People know that song. Perhaps some folks in class 1 or 2 in the aforementioned typology would qualify here. And again, if you want to check that out, part 2, I sort of group the entire music universe based on how they might value heavy music. And type 1 and type 2 people, type 1 people, the vast majority of the world, they don't like heavy music at all, but maybe the odd hit by accident. And then type 2 people, they do like heavy music, but just the hits, right? So these would be people, and there's a whole lot of them that probably are into Poison. They don't really like Alice Cooper, but they like that song. They're a fan of Poison, not really Alice Cooper, right? Given Poison's high exposure, though, it cannot be viewed as commercially underrated. So I don't think there's any way you can say this song is underrated when we're trying to say how it can be valued, right? And since it reeks of trendiness, right, at least at the time for hair metal, I do not see how a convincing argument could be made for it, that it's underappreciated, at least artistically either. So again, I think Poison is not underrated in any way. It can't be. It's a hit for one thing. And I don't think it can be underappreciated because artistically, it's kind of the same as every other hair metal song or similar to them anyway, right? Okay, let's consider another slice of the fan base, if you like. So these would be people that like the song Poison, and they also like Alice Cooper, right? So on the first one, it's people who, they're not particularly Alice Cooper fans, maybe don't know anything about him other than, he chops his head off and wears snakes and stuff. is he's crazy guy, but they like the song Poison. They might not like him at all or care about him, but they like the song Poison. Let's say the second group are people who like Poison, the big hit, and they also like Alice Cooper. So they're fans, right? Okay. So is Poison underrated in any way or something like that? Well, no, it isn't, because they know this part of the fan base, they know that Poison is widely appreciated by the mainstream. And so no added championing is needed here, right? Like an Alice Cooper fan, if they're trying to turn people on to Alice Cooper, right? Oh, they're not necessarily going to say, oh, you should hear that song Poison. It's so underrated. Not enough people hear Poison. No, they're going to go to deeper album tracks or other albums if they really want to turn people on to real Alice Cooper, right? So again, you don't need, no added championing of Poison is going to be needed here, right? The only argument that might be made by an Alice enthusiast who also happens to really enjoy Poison is that it's better than most other hair metal songs. Well, I'm not sure if that really means anything. It wouldn't to me anyway. Say, well, it's better than other hair metal songs, but if you don't like hair metal, I guess that's not going to mean much to you, right? So again, I don't think there's any, when we're trying to figure out how to value Poison, I don't think there's any way you can say it's underrated. It's a hit, right? And whether you're an Alice fan or not, you know that the mainstream gets it. Okay. But what if you are an Alice fan and you're not thrilled with Poison, or maybe you think Poison's okay, but you just didn't like the direction Alice was going at this time, and that would certainly be me. So given that many hardcore Alice fans were troubled by his direction in this era, right? A lot of them might just ignore Poison. That's another plausible outcome, right? And I know a lot of us did that sort of stuff, right? When a lot of our favorite bands went through their hair metal phase and there was a few hits that caught on with the mainstream, we kind of just tried to ignore this, right? So much in the same way, some might have disregarded Judas Priest's hit, Turbo Lover, from the Turbo album. We kind of just went, yeah, whatever. Nugent's Little Miss Dangerous, the title track from the album, was a big hit. And again, a lot of hardcore Nugent fans will say, yeah, whatever, I'm just going to ignore that. Aerosmith's Dude Looked Like a Lady, let's just ignore that. Kisses Forever, yeah, whatever, right? Or in some cases, the hardcore fans just ignored those entire albums from that era, right? Okay, so it might be tempting for hardcore folks to label these songs as overrated, right? But I think that's equally an error. I don't think you can say, even though you might hate these songs, I don't think you can say they're overrated, right? Whether we like it or not, a lot of other people enjoy these obviously contrived poppy tunes, okay? I mean, I don't hate Poison, but it's certainly far from my favorite Alice Cooper song. But I know a lot of people, it is their favorite Alice Cooper song, right? I can't say it's overrated, though, just because a lot of people like it, right? We cannot, with any credibility, say people should not listen to something and that interest in a song such as Poison is somehow unjustifiably excessive, right? If people like it, they like it, right? We can't say they shouldn't listen to something if they enjoy it, right? Now, the only way a song like Poison or Dude Looks Like a Lady or Little Miss Dangerous and all these other songs, right, could be overrated is if someone makes the claim about their great artistic value, right? Now, there I would say you'd have a point, right? If you were to say Poison, oh, what a statement. That is such an innovative song. There's nothing like it. That's Alice Cooper being very creative, right? Now there, I think you could say, no, that's overrated. No, it's not that, right? But honestly, who's making those claims, right? Nobody, right? When you want to listen to the most innovative stuff Alice Cooper ever did, you're not telling people go listen to Poison, right? So again, I don't think you can say these songs are underrated or overrated. They're rated appropriately. They just are what they are, right? Okay, so just to wrap this up and sort of bring it a little more full circle, I guess. In sum, if an artist's work is perceived as genuine, and I think that's the key word there, the authenticity, genuine, and not a product of commercial trends, there's a far higher chance that it will be valued by the hardcore fan, that we're going to really, we're going to get behind that album, right? Moreover, if the hardcore think not enough people like it, there may be inclination to exclaim it's underrated, right? Whether that's justifiable or not, usually not, right? Even though the more casual, mainstream listeners probably not going to care either way. That's a discussion for you metalheads, and I don't care. I like the song, whatever, right? Okay, so bringing this back to King's X and linking it a bit with part 4 and sort of the overall themes here. So how does a band like King's X fit into all of this? Okay, well, as I said at the beginning, they certainly had the melodic catchiness to theoretically appear to the hair metal audience. You might think, well, why weren't the hair metal people all over King's X? They had all this catchiness to them. Problem again, and I explained this more in part 4, King's X were just too diverse, right? Their inherent diversity in both sound and appearance was too off-putting for pop audiences, frankly, who craved a constant supply of syrupy simplicity from bands looking the part, right? In other words, the light and tuneful ditty called Summerland by King's X may have interested a wider audience, especially if King's X wore bright colored spandex and video promotions, which they didn't. They didn't look the part either. But much of the album that it came from, Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, would have been too hard driving and too confusing to them, right? As usual, though, I think the big reason why timing was working against King's X yet again. They began their recording career just as hair metal was about to be replaced by grunge, and when far heavier subgenres were being solidified, all of which provided little or no quarter for adventurous artists defying easy classifications such as King's X, right? So they just couldn't win, no matter how you slice it. I'll say it again. King's X was not underrated, just perpetually out of step with time and trends and seemingly oblivious to fashion. And you know what? That's probably one of the reasons why their core audience loves them so much, right? Because they really didn't care about fashion. They were authentic to the bone, even though they were melodic. All right, that's it for part 5. And part 6, right? We're getting there. Going to continue this theme of, are heavy bands really overrated? Now, here will be a slight twist. Here I'm going to talk about bands, really well-known bands, right, that have certain eras that are not well-known. And it might lead some longtime fans to say that's underrated. And we're going to look at Deep Purple as the case in point, right? So I hope you'll join me for part 6, especially you Deep Purple fans out there. In the meantime, I hope everything is going great for everyone out there. And thank you for listening. Take care.